We might kick off with the housekeeping and various other things. So welcome everybody today. My name's Peter Holding. I work for Farmers for Climate Action, and I'll be your host for this webinar. Dr. Daniel Roberts will be speaking on his work in hydrogen. He works for CSIRO and I'm not exactly sure what his hydrogen work consists of, but no doubt he'll tell us that in a minute. And he's going to tell us where we might be headed in Australia and agriculture with the use of hydrogen, hopefully. So first of all, I'd like to give an acknowledgement to country from Farmers for Climate Action to all the traditional owners of the land on which we work. Currently, I'm in Wiradjuri country in southern New South Wales, and we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present, and to any emerging elders or leaders that might be attending today. So everybody, thank you. Now we'll be operating this webinar in the normal Zoom webinar mode. So you'll be able to put questions in chat. Dr. Roberts will talk for about half an hour, and then we will have questions for the other half hour. So there'll be plenty of time for questions. We will transfer the questions over, but what would be easier is if at the bottom of your screens where you've got Q&A, if you put your questions in there, then they'll all be in the one spot and won't get lost. If there's a lot of chat in the chat box, sometimes they get missed. So, it now being 12:03 and the numbers entering have slowed down, I might welcome Dr. Roberts to this webinar, and thank you for agreeing to come and talk to us today about the future of hydrogen. I'm pretty sure most people will be like me, limited in their knowledge of where hydrogen's at as far as research go and where it's likely to head as far as being used industrially in this country. So, and as farmers, we're particularly interested in how it might be used on farm. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you to enlighten us.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, coming to you today from the western suburbs of Brisbane, the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and of course, any that may be on the line today. And look, it's a real pleasure to be here talking to farmers and the ag sector around hydrogen. Things have really changed in the last few years when we talk about hydrogen. And I'm finding that I'm doing these sorts of talks to a whole bunch of sectors and groups that I would not normally talk to, which is a really good thing in my view. But for me, hydrogen and the agricultural sector is one of those things that's not spoken about enough. I see it as a remarkable opportunity for decarbonisation on a whole bunch of levels, and that's a real opportunity for farmers and the broader sector to really play a role, continuing to play a role in managing our emissions. And so today I'm going to be taking you through what's happening in the world of hydrogen, and hopefully it's of interest to you. I am from CSIRO. I assume, talking to farmers, that most of you know who CSIRO is, Australia's National Science Agency. We do applied research and development right across the industrial sectors of relevance to this country. A proud tradition working in the agricultural space. I come from the energy business, and we do a lot of work now really supporting Australia's transition towards a decarbonised energy system. And hydrogen, of course, is a really important part of that. So I'm assuming you can see my slides. If you can't, you better tell me and I'll do something, but I'll just carry on as if you can.
They're working.
Yeah, good. Thanks, Peter. So look, this is what I'm going to be going through in the next half hour or so. I'll be talking about the re-emergence of hydrogen. I've been around a little while and I've seen hydrogen come and go a couple of times. And it's almost like rings on a tree. You can sort of gauge your experience in this space by how many times you've seen this hydrogen come and go. I'll talk a bit about why we in the space think it's probably different this time, and then I'll touch on what we actually mean by hydrogen energy systems, what's in scope for this. And agriculture, I think, is one of them, but there are many others, and I'll just touch on a couple of examples of the sorts of things we're starting to actually see happen, and then talk about what's next. I think it's important just to keep in the back of our minds that lots of the things I'll be talking about are not necessarily things we can go down to the shop and buy or put an order in on a website and get delivered yet. Some of them are almost at that stage. Some of them are maybe a few years off. Some of them are much further off. But I think what's happening in this space is change at a pace that I've not seen before. So those timelines are likely to condense as a lot more people invest in this space. So Hydrogen 101, my background is in chemistry, and this is where I like to begin these sorts of talks. It is, of course, the most abundant and the lightest element in the universe. It's the simplest. Most hydrogen is just one proton, one electron. And two of those atoms come together to form molecular hydrogen, H2, which is the gas that we're really talking about here in terms of energy systems. We rarely find it naturally. Although we're starting to see some discoveries in this space, it's not really the sort of thing that you dig up and mine. We have to make it, and we usually have to make it from the compounds that it's part of. It's mostly found in water. H2O, you can see the picture of a water molecule there. It's also rich in all the organic compounds, so all of our proteins, minerals, all these sorts of things have got hydrogen in them to various extents. So it is, of course, everywhere, but we have to put in a bit of effort to actually extract it from those sources to use it. And that's where a lot of the really interesting discussions come around what that energy looks like. We'll get to that. It is very flammable. And what's interesting here, and some of the discussions I was having with Peter just beforehand around comparing hydrogen and natural gas and safety and those sorts of things. Hydrogen is flammable over the range 4 to 75 volume percent. That's a concentration number. Now, that's a very wide range. Natural gas is much narrower than that. It's only a 5 to 15% or thereabouts concentration over which it's flammable. And so that immediately gives us an idea of the sorts of things we need to take into account as we transition away from diesel, petrol, natural gas towards things like hydrogen. I don't see that as a challenge. I see it as a job we have to do, but it's a really important one. And hydrogen is, of course, very reactive. It's not just an energy or a fuel source. It's also a really strong, what we call reductant, which means it's really good at pulling oxygen out of things. And so straight away, we start to think about iron ore, which is iron oxides, and the use of hydrogen perhaps to take off those oxygen atoms to leave us with iron. And that's the sort of thing that Fortescue is now talking about quite loudly around potential pathways for green iron and supporting green steel. However, before we get too contemporary, it's worth remembering, I suppose, that hydrogen is already very widely used as an industrial feedstock and has been for 100 and something years. It's used extensively around the world in oil refining, in making ammonia, and I'm sure the people on the call today will be familiar with how much ammonia is used in various sectors. It's used in methanol production and a whole range of other industrial processes. In those scenarios, it's not made somewhere and shipped to these factories in trucks. It's usually produced on site, made in those plants as it's needed, usually from natural gas or from coal. Very well established processes. So that's what we call steam reforming of methane or natural gas, where the CH4 is turned into CO2 and hydrogen, or coal gasification, which is a very established pathway for conversion of coal into liquid fuels, hydrogen fertilizers, especially in places like China. It was in Germany and now in South Africa. What that does, though, is make an awful lot of CO2. And some of these sectors are really quite significant in the amount of CO2 that they produce. And currently all that CO2 is emitted. And so hydrogen use at the moment is industrial, but it's also the source of a fair bit of CO2. When we talk about hydrogen in an energy context, we're talking about a very different use scenario. Many people jump to mobility, which is a logical place to jump. We're talking about fuel cell electric vehicles here, vehicles which take hydrogen, run the hydrogen through a fuel cell, which produces electricity to drive the car. That is, of course, where many people go. That scales up really nicely. Buses and trucks are now emerging as hydrogen-powered vehicles. But hydrogen in an energy context is much more than mobility. We see it now emerging in the electricity sector, both in its production as a way of stabilizing and supporting a high penetration of intermittent renewables, but also in generation, in natural gas decarbonisation. We're seeing it emerge in heavy industry applications. The green iron and steel is one example of that, but there are others. And we're also now talking about hydrogen as a way of exporting Australia's renewable energy to the world, which is getting a lot of people really excited, both in Australia and around the world. And it's about now it's a good time to pause and say, well, why is it different this time? Why is everyone getting so excited about hydrogen when we've been here before? We were here in 2011, we were here around 2000. There was one in the late 70s, and I'm pretty sure there was one in between there somewhere as well. It is a very different situation now, and all I'm seeing is I guess the flow-on effects of that as supporting this notion of hydrogen energy systems. So what we have, which we've never had before, is a really strong global market pool for green and clean hydrogen. Japan has a very ambitious and forward-looking energy vision, and part of that is their basic hydrogen strategy, which relies on the import of an awful lot of green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, because Japan does not have the renewable resources to make their own domestically. Korea is in a similar situation, and even Germany is looking to Australia to supply them with low carbon and green hydrogen as part of their transition towards zero emissions. And so this pool for green hydrogen around the world is new and it's real, and we're only seeing this increase. We've seen significant advances and developments in technology as well. As you know, you can now, I've seen fuel cell electric vehicle cars driving around California and Tokyo. We've just got our own one in CSIRO down in Melbourne as part of one of our demo plants. And what we've seen is through advances in materials, for example, for the tanks that hold the hydrogen, efficiency and effectiveness of some of the drivetrains, we now see the range of these cars comparable with their competition, and the cost associated with them is coming down. You can fill a Toyota Mirai now, 5 kilos of hydrogen as a fill. That costs you about the same as it cost me to fill my Triton on diesel. And well, 2 weeks ago, I would have said you can drive at about 600 or 700 kilometers on that fill. But there was news last week that they drove one in Europe for 1,000 kilometers on one fill, which is pretty impressive. So that is parity with current technology. There are infrastructure challenges associated with that, no doubt. But the point is, we have these technologies now which one can buy and use. The production side has also got to the point where we're seeing deployment. ARENA, for example, which is our renewable energy agency in this country, has just supported 3 big 10 megawatt electrolysis projects. These are renewable electrolysis projects, and 10 megawatts electrolyzers are about as big as you can get for those PEM ones these days. So they're now being deployed, and they're at the start of a significant cost curve trajectory decrease. They're being coupled up with PV electricity, which is very cheap if you get it at the right time. And so these production pathways are now becoming feasible as we talk about these projects. And of course, the old challenge around storing it and moving it is being overcome with new technologies by us and others to move hydrogen around quite effectively. And so we see this coming together of global demand for green hydrogen. Technologies are now becoming at a point where they're getting ready to do that. And we've seen this shift in sentiment in the public, in many governments here and around the world. People really want to see things change now more than they ever have before. And we've got, I'll talk a bit about it in a minute, we've got government strategies, we've got funding schemes in place now to support this, none of which has ever been the case. And so when I tell that story, and I wouldn't have been able to tell that story before, it really is clear to me that things are different this time, and we're on a really good trajectory for hydrogen to play an important role. And we have evidence that the government agrees with us on that. A couple of years ago now, almost, the government released its national hydrogen strategy, and this was a really important piece of work because it had COAG Energy Council, all the different states and their energy ministers agreeing that this is the go. Now that's unusual in itself to have that level of agreement, and I think the appetite for this sort of thing was really set in stone when this strategy was produced and released. And on the back of that came the first low emissions technology statement, throwing a lot of support behind 5 priority areas. One of them, of course, being clean hydrogen, which with that H2 under $2 a kilo stretch target. That's been supported with funding commitments from ARENA, our renewable energy agency, as well as a whole bunch of other initiatives which are emerging on the back of that. So things are really changing. There's sentiment, there's desire, there's potential, and now there's resources and finances. And that is a really good place for us to be as we think about how best to respond to these opportunities. I think it's a good time just to talk about the pathways of hydrogen, because there are a few different ones. I've noticed just out of the corner of my eye that there's a few comments around the different colours of hydrogen, which is always interesting to talk to people about. Personally, I'm not that big a fan of the colour scheme, but I can understand its importance. I prefer to think about carbon intensity of hydrogen, because that's really the goal here, is to make hydrogen with zero carbon emissions. But nonetheless, it can be helpful to help people get the concept. So black, brown or grey hydrogen is the hydrogen I spoke about earlier on, where we've been doing it for 100 years or so to make ammonia, to refine oil, those sorts of things. Coal gasification, gas reforming, that's the traditional way of making hydrogen. It makes a lot of CO2, as I said, and if we can capture that CO2, store it, use it, bind it up somehow, then that is the blue hydrogen that the gas industry in particular is very interested in progressing. Of course, green hydrogen is made from renewables. Usually people talk about that in the context of renewable electricity, driving an electrolyzer to make hydrogen. But there are other green pathways. I think there are some emerging technologies looking at converting biomass waste streams, for example, into hydrogen. That would count as green hydrogen in my books, and play other important roles around bringing other sectors to this space and solving waste problems at the same time. So they're the 3 colours of hydrogen, and of course, once we've made the hydrogen, what we can do with it gets even more convoluted. I talked about the potential to use electrolyzers as a grid servicing tool. So these electrolyzers are often quite flexible in terms of their draw on the grid. They can be ramped up and down pretty quickly, and that allows them to, I guess, help manage some of the intermittency of the grid as we put more and more intermittent renewables into it, whilst also producing hydrogen, which is effectively an energy storage pathway. So the notion of hydrogen storage in the context of grids is interesting because that complements the battery scenario. Batteries are really good at fast response, short times, storing hydrogen and putting it back into the grid in power generation opens up a much longer time frame for storage. And that diversity of storage is something that we really, really need at the moment. I've talked a bit about mobility. I've talked a bit about grid services. Industrial decarbonisation is one where we're looking at the iron and steel, the cement, the alumina sectors, traditional CO2 emitters, categorised as hard to abate sectors. Hydrogen has a role to play there. We're seeing hydrogen being talked about in the context of air travel now, which is something that even a few years ago, we probably wouldn't have thought too much about. I did touch on this export angle, and once we've got lots of hydrogen made in a carbon-free way, we can store it and move it around. And we've seen some real advances in that storage and moving it around space in the last few years. Our own work in ammonia, which I'll talk a bit about, allows us to have the hydrogen as ammonia, but then crack it back to very pure hydrogen at the other end, which completes that value chain. There are other pathways. There's a lot of interest in liquid hydrogen, which of course is a space-like technology. And all of these different intermediates have pros and cons, and I expect we'll see a mixture of carriers used, as we open up the global market here. And of course, once that hydrogen or ammonia is exported, those same applications become in scope and are then powered by Australia's renewable energy. And that's a tantalising prospect, I think. And people are looking to Australia for lots of geopolitical reasons to play a real role there. And as I said, we're seeing some of these things begin to happen already. Mobility is, as one might expect, one of the earlier movers here. You can buy these Toyota Mirais, these Hyundai Nexos. We've recently leased a Toyota Mirai for our site down in Melbourne. There is this classic chicken and egg problem here. No one's going to want to buy one of these because you can't fill it up anywhere. But no one's going to want to put in a refueling station because no one's bought them yet, and then it'll just sit there unused. The way to fix that is demonstration and fleet activities, I think, and that's what we're starting to see. So we're doing our bit there by partnering up with Toyota and having a bit of a hydrogen highway between our site in the east of Melbourne and Toyota's site in the west. And the Canberra government has got some hydrogen Hyundais and are using them as their fleet car. Because they're back to base, because they're self-contained, they can have a single refueling station, which is their own, and run their fleet on that. Really good ways of starting to overcome that classic chicken and egg problem. We're seeing some of these larger applications emerge as well. This is a slide talking about hydrogen-powered mining trucks, which some of the really big ones, which are sort of electric motor driven already, and that electricity comes from an onboard diesel generator. They're quite amenable to conversion because it's a replacement of a diesel generator with a hydrogen fuel cell. And some of the rest of the drive chain remains largely unchanged. So that's a really nice example of how we can convert some of these sorts of large vehicles and diesel-intensive vehicles to hydrogen. We're also seeing this sort of thing emerge now with trains and trucks custom purpose-built trucks coming out of the US running on hydrogen. And I think that's the scale thing, which is going to be a bit of a delineator, I think, between the battery electric vehicles and the hydrogen vehicles. I think battery electric vehicles are really well suited to short distances, the city commuting type of approach where you drive a short-ish distance and you leave the car there for a while and you can charge up. You drive it home again and you can leave it there for a while and charge up. That works really well, and that's unlikely to be a space where hydrogen will play a role. As we get bigger and heavier, and the battery would need to get bigger and heavier, as you want to go longer distances, if you want to refuel quicker, then hydrogen vehicles become a little bit more attractive. And that's why we're seeing some of this movement in trucks, buses, and that sort of thing. We have seen some movement recently in small to medium scale storage as well. On the right there is a recently announced product based on some University of New South Wales technology called Lavo. It's marketed as a hydrogen battery. What it really is an integrated fuel cell, metal hydride storage and electrolyzer system, which is designed for domestic use. So this is using hydrogen as a way of storing energy and then creating that power again, much as you would a battery at home, but with hydrogen. That's a really interesting innovation. And in the news last week, CSIRO partnered up with Ampol and our venture capital firm and created a company called Endure, which is a similar concept around energy storage, but a bit larger scale. We're sort of talking about kilowatts, hundreds of kilowatts here. Not off the shelf yet, like the Lavo system, but certainly undergoing commercialization. And this is where we're at with some of this energy storage, diesel generator replacement type of applications. And this is going to accelerate quickly, I think, as more and more work is done in this space. Storing it and moving it around, though, becomes really interesting. And that's where I think we get a lot of connections with the agriculture sector. And that's because of the use of ammonia as a storage and distribution medium. So compressed gas, solid state storage, like that Lavo example I just showed. We've spoken a bit about liquid hydrogen in terms of large scale ships for moving hydrogen around the world. Ammonia has an interesting role to play. We already make a lot of ammonia in this country from hydrogen made from natural gas. We have a lot of ships and infrastructure and legislation and safety standards around moving this stuff around and sending it around the world. There's ports, there's logistic facilities. And so ammonia, if we replace hydrogen from natural gas with green hydrogen, becomes green ammonia, and is a really hydrogen dense molecule. It's NH4, it's a liquid at much higher temperatures. And because we know how to move it around, this opens up a whole new, I guess, realm of possibilities here, what we can do with ammonia. And I think this is where the agriculture sector gets relevant here, because of course we can crack ammonia back to high purity hydrogen, not really necessarily an agricultural application. That's more of an export scenario where perhaps we send ammonia made from green hydrogen to Japan. They then crack that back to hydrogen to use in their fleet, their cars and those sorts of things, driving their cars on Australian renewable energy. Some of our work in using ammonia directly in modified diesel engines is really, really interesting. So ammonia does burn, doesn't like to ignite, but once it gets going, it's pretty good. And so our researchers in Newcastle are trying to figure out how best to modify some of the fuel systems on diesel engines to support ammonia's use as a fuel. Now, it tends to be more suited to the slower speed diesel engines. So what we really see a lot of interest in is in shipping very large ships, the megawatt scale engines, the very slow speed diesel engines, and we're teaming up with some partners at the moment to do a bit of demonstration work at large scale on using ammonia in those diesel engines. This is really interesting. Some of the big leading engine manufacturers, MAN and Wärtsilä and others that make these megawatt scale engines, are very interested in using ammonia in them. The global shipping industry is really struggling, I think, at the moment to figure out how it's going to address its emissions problems. So there's some talk about using LPG. That'll get them part of the way. But if they're going to modify bunkers and ports and ships, then perhaps ammonia could be a path forward. It's not without its challenges. Ammonia is toxic. It does have odor issues, but again, I think those things are fixable if we really want to make a difference. So using ammonia directly in diesel engines can allow us to power ships. It may even allow us to directly power locomotives. It might, I don't know if it's going to work on our Land Cruisers or our tractors. I'm not really sure yet. I think there's a bit of work to do there. But certainly the bigger the engine is and the slower the speed is, the more amenable it is to ammonia. And that also allows us to create electricity directly from ammonia. We can export this stuff or store hydrogen and move this stuff around, use it as a fuel for power generation. And engines with a generator, one way of doing that. Using it directly in a special fuel cell is another way of doing that. And we've got some work going on to use ammonia in fuel cells to support power generation. Now, this gets quite interesting because traditionally we make ammonia in very large Haber-Bosch processes. They're enormous, they're very intensive, they're not really suited to putting in a shed on a farm. Some of the work that we're doing in next generation technologies for making ammonia is all around scaling it down and making it more amenable to integration with renewables. And so there is this potential down the track for on-farm ammonia production, which could then support fertilizer, making your own fertilizer from the sun, making your own power from the sun, and really reducing reliance on diesel and imported carbon-intensive ammonia-based fertilizers. As I said at the outset, that's probably not the sort of thing that we can expect to go and buy from Bunnings in a couple of years' time, but it's certainly on the development trajectory. And I think as we look more and more for opportunities for supply and demand scenarios to support scaling up of hydrogen projects, these sorts of things are going to become very, very interesting indeed. And we're seeing it happen already. We're seeing big projects now getting various stages of funding. Yarra up in the Pilbara has teamed up with ENGIE to make some green hydrogen via electrolysis and use that in their ammonia plant. There's a good project emerging in two sites now, from the Hydrogen Utility down in South Australia and up in Gladstone, and of course in Tasmania at the moment. They're really going through a process of figuring out the best way of linking up their very cheap and very abundant, as long as it doesn't stop raining, hydropower resource with the potential for a green ammonia industry as well. So pretty interesting times. As I wrap up, we always come back to the challenge of scale. And it's all very well for someone like me to sit here and talk about all these wonderful things we can do with hydrogen, how it could decarbonize anything you can think of, all of which is true. But it all needs an awful lot of hydrogen. And we can see here a prediction by the Hydrogen Council. This is a couple of years old, and it's probably one of the more ambitious predictions, I think, but nonetheless, it demonstrates the growth we can expect to see in clean hydrogen demand over the next 20 or 30 years. 80 exajoules is their prediction by 2050, and as you can see on the list there, that's a disturbingly large amount of energy. It's a lot of solar panels, it's a lot of windmills, and I think it's going to need a lot more than just PV and wind plugging into some electrolyzers. We're going to have to see integration of sectors. We're going to have to see the waste sector come into play. We're going to have to see the agricultural sectors come in and have their role too, which I think is fantastic, because I think that has flow-on effects. It allows farmers to rely less on diesel. It means we don't need to use however many tens of millions of litres of diesel out in the Pilbara to mine our iron ore anymore. It has a lot of potential. It means our waste management sector can actually make money out of doing things other than sending their waste to landfill. I see this as a real opportunity, but it does need a bit of work. And I think one of the things that we do here at CSIRO with our partners around the place is the research to support new technologies which are cheaper to make the hydrogen, to make the ammonia, to move it around, but also to perhaps reduce the number of process steps that we need to do that. Instead of having to go from sunlight to electricity to hydrogen to ammonia, one example of what we're working on is a technology that works at ambient conditions and takes air, water, and sunlight and produces the ammonia directly. That's not going to be ready in a couple of years' time, but that's the kind of thing that could really shift the equation here in terms of scale, efficiency, and cost, and it's really exciting to be part of. I mentioned this notion of sector coupling and how we need more pathways to link together to both provide the green ammonia that people, sorry, the green hydrogen and ammonia that people want, but also the utilisation scenarios to drive the scaling up, which is what has to happen at the moment. And that's what we're starting to see. Research, demonstration, development at scale, showing that these pathways exist, doing the work to help de-risk them, and also linking up with our international partners to show that this is real, this is possible, and Australia is here to do its bit to reduce the emissions from around the world. So Peter, I'll stop there. That's my half hour, I suspect. I'm really happy now to take questions, and I'll leave it up to you to figure out how we manage that.
I'll handle that. Thanks, Daniel. That was a very informative talk, and it's left my head spinning. I don't know about anybody else's, but anyway, we've got a lot of questions, so I'll start at the top. Ian Kruger has asked, I've read that hydrogen has a detrimental effect on metal pipes. Is this so, and how will the problem be faced?
Yeah, it is sometimes so. It depends on the metal and it depends on the conditions. The phenomenon is called hydrogen embrittlement. And so we do know a lot about how hydrogen interacts with steel metals. And when the conditions are right and the steel is of a certain sort, the hydrogen can diffuse into the metal and actually help it to, or cause it to lose a lot of its integrity. And that's a real problem if we're talking about steel being used to carry gas at pressure around the place. We do know a lot about it though, and we do know a lot about the conditions under which it happens and the sorts of things we need to do to prevent it from happening, both from an operational perspective, but also from the perspective of what we make our pipes out of. I think this is a really important part of considering how some of the industrial applications of hydrogen get deployed. People often talk about replacement of natural gas in various forms with hydrogen in some of these processes. That's usually quite possible, but we do need to start to think about some of the materials considerations and whether we're actually going to damage things in doing so. And that's why some of the projects around the world looking at conversion of natural gas pipelines in cities are actually replacing the pipes with PVC as they upgrade their networks, because PVC is much more suited to moving hydrogen around. And so they're planning for the future by getting materials selected upfront.
All right, and sort of carrying on for that question, because you mentioned it about natural gas, Peter Lane has asked, he's interested to know how compatible hydrogen is with natural gas for power generation, and if blended, does the ratio have to remain constant, or can it be changed depending on the likely hour to hour, certainly daily, change in available green hydrogen?
I think that depends. To go back to the first, I guess quite compatible is the answer, and we're seeing the sorts of projects, the demo projects going on around the country at the moment. ATCO over in Perth, Gemma in Sydney, down in South Australia as well. They're blending a few percent, I think it's 5, maybe a little bit more percent hydrogen into their gas networks at the moment, green hydrogen into their gas networks. And they are not anticipating any significant changes in the way things work at those low percentages. When we start to go higher than that, we need to start to think about the energy density of the gas, some safety aspects around materials choice. Embrittlement is one of them. How the appliances are going to function, how we meter the gas, all these sorts of things. But what's really good is that work is being done now. We're seeing those demo projects deployed, and the learnings from that are going to really feed into being able to answer these sorts of questions with certainty. Whether that it sounds like the question is probably coming more from a gas-fired power station context, and again, I think the new build gas generation that's been in the media lately is looking at being able to take up to 5% hydrogen, I think, and that's pretty small. I think I don't anticipate that to have a significant impact, and they should be able to handle the fluctuations at those low levels.
Right, now we have two questions of sort of on a similar line, using hydrogen as batteries. One from Lauriston wants to know if hydrogen fuel cells will replace powered vehicles and household batteries, given the waste issues with conventional batteries. And the other one wants to know what the efficiency of a hydrogen battery is as compared to the energy goes in, how much comes out, I guess.
So the first question was around batteries, about fuel cells and replacing batteries as a storage concept. Look, I don't think we're going to see batteries go away and hydrogen systems take their place. I think that's probably unnecessary. I think batteries perform really important roles in lots of really useful situations. And the waste angle that the questioner brought up is not likely to be absent in the hydrogen space either. So electrolyzers, fuel cells, these are at the heart of a hydrogen energy system. And they also require, special metals, novel materials. It's not just batteries that will rely on some of the, the precious metals and other resources. So, I think it's important to acknowledge that any system we use has to be made from something, and it's just a matter about getting, I think, the right tool for the job. And so, as I mentioned, I think when we come to cars, small cars, city commuting, the right tool for that job probably is batteries. As we get bigger and want to go further, the right tool for that's probably going to be hydrogen. And certainly as we get up to the scale of trucks and ships, it's unlikely to be a battery scenario.
All right. This is a little bit of a political question, I guess, but Daryl Fellow was asked an interesting question on government. Government talks about clean hydrogen more rather than green hydrogen. What work has been done in Australia in adopting a standard to define what level of CO2 emissions constitutes clean hydrogen? Are we likely to adopt European standards?
It is an interesting question, and it's not too political, so I can still have a go at answering it. Look, the whole notion of hydrogen accreditation is really important, and I do know that the government is actively figuring out how best to do that right now. It's up the top of their list in terms of what they do, because it is really important. Japan won't buy hydrogen from us if in producing that hydrogen we emit a lot of CO2. They haven't suggested yet what that threshold might be, and I think there's a bit of toing and froing to go yet before we're in a position where we can probably quantify what clean really means. And I think the use of the word clean is probably for that reason. I think internationally there are systems. I know there's a Certify program in Europe, for example, which does put a bit of a carbon intensity number against hydrogen, and I think from memory, and my memory's not very good, it might have benchmarked that against natural gas. I think we can probably do a bit better than that, but time will tell where we actually land on quantifying what clean really means.
Okay, now here's a question for the farming community. Andrew's asked, as farmers who have already committed to being carbon neutral well before the legislation demanded it, which options for on-farm hydrogen production are closest to reality? And as an addendum to that, I'm wondering myself what sort of scale is likely to be used by farms. So are we talking a scale, maybe individual farms or maybe regional communities, or what are we?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, and that's why I tried to sort of put a slide in there which showed, some offering, or at least the Lado offering, for example, which is a domestic scale energy storage system, as being what you can buy now. So, I said this at the outset, a lot of what we're talking about here is not really the sort of thing you can go and buy right now. But my feeling is it won't be long before they start to emerge. Fuel cell cars, at-home hydrogen storage, hydrogen battery type of technologies, you can buy them now. They're off the shelf. You can ring up and order a refueling station. It might cost you a couple of $1 million, but you can buy one. Now, that's not really on the cards for your average farmer yet, I wouldn't have thought. However, as we start to come up with technologies that allow us to make perhaps ammonia on farm, to me that's a shift that changes the way we do things. And by the time those sorts of technologies emerge, I reckon there'll be a bunch of ammonia pathways as well. So you can make your own ammonia and perhaps even use that as part of your fertilizer. You may well be able to use that as to run your generators on, for example, as well. Hybridizing batteries and solar and wind in this way is a really powerful thing to do. And so, again, it might not be at farm scale, but there's a mine up in Canada, which as a Glencore, the Raglan mine. It has a couple of 3 megawatt windmills linked up to a combined battery, hydrogen and flywheel storage system. Now that, I like that because it shows that batteries and hydrogen are not necessarily competing. They're actually quite complementary in the roles they play in storage. And that's part of a bigger system that already saves them 4.5 million litres a year of diesel. And that's perhaps not production line technology, but it's stuff that they could bring up and purchase. So things are changing fast. We're seeing these things now at scales which are probably bigger than farm scale, but I don't think it'll be long before we can start to see this sort of these opportunities become real for these sorts of applications.
Right. Now here's a question for you, Daniel, that we were discussing earlier before the webinar started, from Jonathan. Very interested in hearing your insights on the relationship between current water problems in Australian ag and the water required for H2 production.
Yeah, this often comes up, and I'm glad it does. You need water to make hydrogen. There's no doubt about that. You need water to do a lot of the things that hydrogen is hopefully going to offset and replace. And I think that water intensity is often overlooked, I guess. And so hopefully by replacing operations that are water intensive with another operation that is less water intensive, this electrolysis pathway, there's a net benefit. But I think it's also true to say that there are other options here. If there's a region which is struggling with water supply, well, that's probably not the sort of place you'd do a electrolysis project to make hydrogen, and you'd come up with a different scenario. There are also technologies emerging which don't need potable water as the feed for the electrolyzer. Us and others are doing a lot of work looking at wastewater streams, brackish water. There are projects taking seawater through a desalination system and using that into an electrolyzer. So I think the flexibility is there. It's just about getting site selection right, and again, the horses for courses angle. The only other comment to say there is you don't need necessarily to make your green hydrogen from water electrolysis. There are pathways to look at waste streams and woody waste streams, biomass waste, those sorts of things, and gasification pathways there which can produce hydrogen too, which don't need as much water. So lots of opportunities to make bespoke situations that fit the need.
All right. Now, Colin Sager has asked, are there any downsides to the use of hydrogen, especially on the environmental side? I've heard concern remixing of hydrogen / byproducts in the upper atmosphere. Are there possible climate implications of the massive use of hydrogen?
Look, I love that question because it's a question I ask my researchers here a lot, because what we don't want is to create another massive problem in our attempts to try and fix the carbon emission problem. And so what's interesting here is that we don't actually know enough about atmospheric chemistry at the moment to be able to be definitive in saying, don't worry about it, it's going to be okay. And that's a problem. And that's why we're doing the work that we're doing to try and fix that up. So we've got some work going on looking at atmospheric chemistry, trying to elucidate some of those reaction mechanisms that we think will be important. One example, there's the hydroxyl radical, which is up there in the atmosphere. It does have a really important role in maintaining clean atmospheric conditions. It is quite reactive towards things like hydrogen. Is that going to cause a problem? There's some work to do there to figure it out. So It is a really good question. I can't give a really good answer from that perspective, other than to say we're working on it, because we understand that it's, that we don't want to create a bigger problem here by trying to solve one. I think some of the other challenges around hydrogen usually come back to the production pathways of choice, and whether we're going down a path that's relying on things like natural gas and coal, or we're going to rely on greenfield renewables and electrolysis. There's a few variables there.
Thank you. Now, John Ridley would like to know on the ammonium story, can you explain the switch from H2 to H3, how easy it is at scale?
H2 to H3, I'm assuming that's hydrogen to ammonia. NH3. Yeah, look, so the Haber-Bosch process is how we make NH3 ammonia, and have been doing for 100 years. It takes hydrogen, and it gets that hydrogen usually from natural gas reforming, which produces the CO2. It takes nitrogen, which it separates from the air in an air separation unit, puts those into a reaction system at very high pressures, pretty high temperatures, over a special catalyst, and that combines them into NH3, which is the ammonia that we make. That's a very old process. It's a very established process, energy intensive, CO2 emitting, and quite big, and not particularly, the challenge there isn't so much the scaling up, it's the scaling down to allow something like on-farm production. And the good thing about that process is, and we saw it in one of the examples I gave, where Yara and Engie are teaming up in the Pilbara, we can replace some of the hydrogen that process takes, which it gets from natural gas, with renewable hydrogen, with very little change to the overall process. And what that does is fairly low risk way of getting familiar at an industrial scale with the use of green hydrogen, and also decarbonises the production of ammonia straight away. So the scale there is our friend in terms of getting things moving. It's a real challenge for us if we want to start to think about how we can produce our hydrogen and ammonia on our farms, because the scaling down is a bit of a challenge. And that's what we've got some technology development underway to try and fix that.
All right. Now, Ivan Quayle would like to know, and probably sort of similar to that last question, how would ammonia be stored on farm? So it's a scale down problem.
Yeah, look, and I looked to the US here. I was at a lecture by the Ammonia Safety Association, I think they call themselves, and they come out of the US, and there I think it's different in general to the way it's done here. Although you might want to correct me. They have these nurse tanks, they call them, of ammonia there. And some of those are pressurized and some of those are not. I think that the ones that are not so pressurized have it as a liquid. Ones that are pressurized have it as a gas. The liquid ones in particular are used to store ammonia on farms already in the US. And I was shown some video footage of how they use it. It was really interesting. And so storing ammonia is, the reason we like that from a hydrogen perspective is that we know how to do it. So, there's these massive big tanks up in the Pilbara at the moment full of ammonia waiting to be shipped around the world. That does scale down pretty nicely. Liquid ammonia in tanks is not particularly challenging, and we can look to the US for examples of how they do that quite effectively.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I've got an anhydrous ammonia tank on my air seeder, so for dropping liquid gas into the ground.
Yeah.
So that's already done. Ivan Quayle would also like to know, what about pyrolysis to make H2? Does it use less energy?
Pyrolysis to make hydrogen, that's a beauty. So I spoke about gasification as a way of turning coal or biomass waste into hydrogen via that syngas route. Pyrolysis is similar but different. It's a thermal process. So it's about heating up some sort of feedstock, some sort of carbonaceous feedstock usually. And so in the context of agriculture, woody waste, timber mill residues, those sorts of things. If we heat those up in the absence of oxygen, we do a thing called pyrolysis, which breaks it down into its into some of its components. That does two things. That makes a horribly dirty syngas full of tars and oils and hydrogen, and it makes a biochar. And I'm fairly sure many of us on the call are pretty familiar with biochar and its applications. If not, I'm happy to talk about that. Biochar is mostly carbon. It's quite porous. It turns out that it's really good as a soil ameliorant, and it can be used as a way of getting fertilizers and into the soil, and also long-term storage of carbon dioxide, of carbon in the soils. The dirty syngas that you make, which has hydrogen in it, needs to be processed to get that hydrogen out. And so pyrolysis is pretty attractive because doing the pyrolysis bit's really easy. You can do it in a drum over a campfire, but the processing of the downstream gas can sometimes be a bit of a pain, and there's some expenses there depending on what quality of gas you want. But there are some fairly simple systems which take most of that gas, burn it to make the heat to drive the pyrolysis process. Getting the hydrogen out of there is probably a bit of an addition, I guess, into what we would normally do. We're thinking a bit about how we can get hydrogen out of various syngas streams, because I guess much like the question, and we see that as another option for integrating waste management, carbon storage, and hydrogen production.
Okay. Now, Richard Bentley, and we're sort of running up to time, but anyway, we'll have this question, then I'll do some closing remarks, and then we'll probably, with Daniel's consent, have a few more final questions. So Richard's asked, is there any measure of the potential cost of green versus grey hydrogen, and will carbon capture and storage costs kill coal generated or gas generated hydrogen?
There's a lot to unpack there. The short answer is yes, there are plenty of studies out there comparing the cost of these things. I mean, grey hydrogen, natural gas reforming, is pretty cheap. It's how it's been done for so long, and it's been refined, and it's pretty cost effective. Adding storage onto that is always going to increase the cost. It'll be interesting to see how it pans out as to how significant that cost is. 20 years ago, when we were talking about carbon capture and storage in the context of coal-fired power, the equation was a bit different. It was, in this country, it was usually being discussed in the context of retrofitting fairly inefficient and old plant, which was not a particularly effective thing to do in terms of power production and CO2 generation. The equation's a bit different when we're talking about natural gas and blue hydrogen, although in this country we don't have, apart from a couple of demo projects, a lot of experience on which to draw. The US situation is different. They actually have CO2 as a bit of a commodity over there, using it in things like enhanced oil recovery. It's actually, there's a market for CO2, and so you can capture CO2 and sell it, and it gets used not perhaps in a particularly carbon-free manner, but nonetheless, those economics shift the way that the technologies can be deployed and how the projects can be banked on. So in this country, it will add a cost to the grey hydrogen, and there's plenty of studies out there that you can look up to show how that happens. What's interesting is that we're now seeing data emerge that suggests that the cost of the green hydrogen is coming down so fast that it won't be very long. Some are saying 10 years, even maybe less, where blue hydrogen and green hydrogen costs are on par. 10-year economic models are not really my thing, and they'll change in 5 years anyway. But I think what we're seeing is the cost of the green stuff come down much faster than the cost of the blue stuff or the grey stuff.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you to all the attendees, and thank you to Daniel. That's been a more than interesting discussion, and I'm sure it will go on for a while. I've still got a heap of questions, so I'll close up the webinar officially now, and if you're happy just to hang around for another 10 minutes, we might do a few more questions for people that are interested.
Yeah, sure. Happy to hang around.
Well, thank you. Now, just before we do move on to more questions, I'd just like to let you know that FCA next week has another webinar on based in South Australia, coming from South Australia, on an introduction to Farmers for Climate Action. It's mostly for the South Australian farmers, but it might be interested for anybody who wants to know what we do and how we do it. There's also Hepburn Shire is launching their net zero ag emissions webinar next week. That'll be around, some of you may not be aware that Hepburn Shire has got their own wind farm to generate their own electricity in Hepburn Springs. And also, for any other information and a copy of this recording, you can go to Farmers for Climate Action website. That's farmersforclimateaction.org.au. All right, so thank you to everybody. We'll call that a close, but we'll now go on and answer a couple more of these questions that I've got here. Well, let me go. I've just lost my place. Here's an interesting one from Claudia. How much energy is required to extract hydrogen back out of ammonia?
Yeah, and this points to what I was talking about earlier around the value in reducing the number of process steps we do here, because each time you convert from something to something else, you're going to lose energy. And the ammonia to hydrogen step, I don't know what the actual number is, I'm sorry, but it is quite an energy intensive step. What has changed in recent times is some of our own work where we've looked at some new technologies for separating hydrogen from ammonia, which has significantly addressed that energy penalty, and also allows us to make the hydrogen in one go very, very pure. And so there's the ammonia to hydrogen step, but there's also the purification that you need to do if you want to use it into a fuel cell. And so some of our work there has addressed that. My colleagues put a paper out a few years ago looking at the efficiency of going from sunlight in Australia to a Mirai in Tokyo, and it was 20-something%. And I think most people go, oh wow, that's really, really low. And I guess it kind of is, until you think about what we actually did, which is take sunlight from Australia and use it to drive a car in Tokyo. It's also the start of the curve. I think things are going to get much more much more efficient as we do more and more work and deploy these things. But also the efficiency argument for me really comes from a mindset of using liquid fuel on a car, and where you want to get a certain number of kilometers for a tank, and that's okay. I think the efficiency argument is a little different when you're thinking about what we're doing here, about taking huge amounts of renewable energy and moving it around the world. So these are the things that are bothering my colleagues at the moment, is how to fix some of these things.
Right. Now, here's an interesting one. Richard Bentley has asked, there are trials commencing for home delivery of 5% hydrogen in Adelaide's gas supply, but 100% in the UK. When can we expect to see 100% hydrogen delivered in the current network, or what might be the barriers?
Yeah, I don't know when. You'd have to ask down there. It's I guess it's AGIG, isn't it, down there? That they'd know all about that. But the barriers are fairly well understood, I think. And the question was absolutely right. In the north of England, a while ago now, they started this quite ambitious project to convert Leeds, the city of Leeds, from natural gas into 100% hydrogen. Now, that's not a case of just turning on a valve. There's a lot of work to do there. They were lucky that they'd already upgraded their pipes. So one of the first questions was around embrittlement. So they'd already moved away from metal pipes into PVC pipes, which was a big step they had to do. A lot of work around appliances and making sure the appliances are going to work, educating the customers around safety, legal issues around metering. The energy per volume of hydrogen gas is different to methane. Are you getting what you pay for? What are you paying for? Those sorts of questions are interesting. Yeah, so there's a lot of work to do to go from a fairly low risk 5% to much above 20%, I think. But it's not impossible, and we can look to the north of England, I think, as a real exemplar on how to do this sort of thing properly.
Okay. Now, Steve Batty has asked, are there any performance hits in power torque output of the vehicle between hydrogen and petroleum-based engines?
Oh, I don't think there's any hits at all. My experience is that they're bloody amazing, frankly. So these are electric drivetrains. So for those that have ever driven a battery electric vehicle, the hydrogen ones drive very similar. Torque all the time, whenever you want it, fast if you want that. Yeah, don't worry about performance is my advice.
I don't know whether you can answer this one, but there's a question here. I just can't find it, but I'll get to it eventually. But how much government support is there for the development of green hydrogen in Australia, given its potential?
Yeah, look, a fair bit. I think most of that is what is coming through on those slides I showed around the projects that ARENA is funding. That they've just put a lot of money towards 3 10-megawatt electrolyzer demonstrations. One of those is up in the Pilbara, which I think is the Odgy Yarra collaboration. That's making putting some green and hydrogen into their ammonia plant. And then the other two, there's one in Victoria somewhere, and one down in South Australia, I think, doing the gas pipeline injection work. And so that's ARENA is a government funded agency, so that's government funding to get this green hydrogen going, which is really good to see. The CEFC, which is the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, it's our green bank effectively, it's also now been given the green light to look at hydrogen projects, which is a really good development. It's going to be a big part of managing the risk associated with this sort of thing. And I think that sort of support is really important to get this stuff going at scale.
All right, well, that might do us for today, I think. I'm sure if anybody's got a particular question they'd like to ask us, we'll deal with that through an email.
Sure, happy to do that.
So people can email me at peter@farmersforclimateaction.org.au, and I shall pass it on to Daniel. But thanks for attending, and thank you, Daniel. That's been a very interesting little discussion there.
Excellent.
Lots of opportunity and lots of things to think about.
Plenty of work to do.
So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the chance. Cheerio.
Thanks so much, Daniel. See you, everyone. Bye.